teaching. So we are blessed here and to have Professor Fox with us. Professor Fox is the Ellen M. Glick Professor of Judaic and Biblical Studies and Director of the Program of Jewish Studies at Clark University, and a great scholar, and most famously known for his translation of the Torah that was published in Schocken Books in 1995, and recently 2014 the translation of the early prophets, which would eventually become, it's the Schocken Bible Volume 2, and I hope that we'll get to see as soon as possible the whole Schocken Bible. Just kind of an anecdotal point, I was talking with an Australian friend, and they said that in colloquial Australian English, Schocken is not a very good thing. So what's a Schocken Bible? Yeah, it's not a very good Bible. So that's the Australian. By the way, maybe we'll get to it down the road. I have this, okay? I collect Bibles. I have about shy of 100 different Bibles. That's the Aussie Bible. There is even such a thing, but we'll get to it. And I want to start with an apology. It's not a personal apology. It's an apology that was written 2,150 years ago, or thereabout. Okay, it's a very interesting apology, and it's a very much related to our discussion. This is an apology written in obviously Greek by the grandson of Ben Sira, Yehoshua Ben Sira. Since everybody reads Greek, no problem, we can read it in Greek. Nah, really, I also brought the English for those of us whose Greek days are long or gone. And in his preface to his translation of his grandfather's work, he writes the following. He apologizes. In the earlier translation, it would be, let me entreat you to read this that way. This is the New English translation of the Septuagint, and it says the following: you are invited, therefore, to a reading with goodwill and attention, and to exercise forbearance in cases where we may be thought to be insipid with regard to some expressions that have been the object of great care in rendering. Why? For what was originally expressed in Hebrew, and that is the first time we actually have the term Hebrew recorded for the Hebrew language, does not have, that's what I know, it does not have the same. We have Judean in the Bible, Yehudit, but Hebrew, first time used as a language, that's what I know, Hebraisti in the Greek, does not have the same force when it is in fact rendered in another language. And he continues to say that it's not just in this particular book, but in the other books of the Bible. So that apology, I think, is kind of sits in the basis of translation, and especially translation of the Bible when we get to talk about it.
No.
And I want to ask you, first of all, what is your understanding of translation, especially in regards to translation of the Bible?
Well, one of the things you have to accept when you go into this business, if I can call it that, is you have to be willing to accept defeat. And that means there are things that you will not be able to do. You can try very hard to do them, but there will always be passages and moments and maybe larger pieces that are simply impossible to do justice to. But that doesn't mean that one doesn't try. So my approach, I would say, is to try and move the reader closer to the text, if that's possible. Each language has its own challenges. You can do certain things in English that you can't do in other languages, and vice versa. So you have to be realistic about it, but also be willing to push the boundaries so that the reader realizes that this is not a work that was written in English originally or in the 20th century. We are very much like ancient humans in many ways, but not entirely. And our world is somewhat different. So one has to allow for differences. But my desire is to, in a way, wake the reader up. And does that mean coming back to this idea of shocking? Do I want to shock them all the time? Not necessarily, but I do want them to sit up and take notice. And the analogy that I use, and it's not just an idea, but it's a reality for me, is musical performance or dramatic performance, where you can go to a play or a concert that's performing a work that you know very well, maybe for many years, and yet something that goes on stage makes you sit up and take notice. It's not the work you thought it was. You see new things, you hear new things. So that's really what I want for the reader, is to become much more aware of what's happening in the Hebrew, to the extent that I can reproduce that or echo that in English.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about accepting defeat, in a sense, and that's understandable. I think it was also reflected by the apology of Ben Sira when he is accepting
Sure.
defeat. Yeah, and obviously there is strategic defeat and there are tactical defeats in different aspects of it. So when
Sure.
you have a given blanket, so to speak, what are the parts when you have to decide, okay, so this is essential to me, and I can, play a little bit more loose with other elements of the text. So what for you would be more essential, and what would be less essential when you translate?
Sure. So one example of that might be what Buber called the Leitwort, or the leading word. In many texts, can be a smaller unit, can be an entire story, it can be an entire book. There are words in the Hebrew that will recur, or better, a root that will recur, a three-letter root. And I always have to make the decision, since Hebrew and English don't correspond word for word, you don't always want to reproduce the same Hebrew word by the same English word. But if I think it's something important to the story, then I will push the boundaries. So, for instance, there are many cases
we have your translation here for the Chumash. So if you have any examples you want, we can put it on screen.
At the beginning of Shemot, at the beginning of Exodus, in chapter 2, I would say 2 and 3, the verb ra'o, to see, occurs a great deal. Let's see if we can get that. Yeah. So a whole number of times that verb will appear in the childhood or the infancy of Moses. And as you hear it initially, you don't think too much about it, and you could, as any elementary school student would do, you could vary the language if you want to write a good composition. So in one case you might say look, in another case you might say gaze, and at another time you might say see. But as you go through this story, what you find is that again and again, this is an important motif. So when Moses grows up, for instance, he goes out to see his brothers, and he sees an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man. It's a little bit further on, and he looks this way and that. He saw that there was nobody else around. So we're beginning to hear this word. Well, what's the point? Why do we have to stick to the same word? When we get to the burning bush, which is in a way the climax of Moses' early life, God appears to him in the flame, And what's the first thing that he really says? Ra'o ra'iti et onni ami. I have seen, yes, seen the affliction of my people. In other words, because this word threads through the entire narrative, I think we're entitled to see how the early life of Moses and his mission that's coming up are all tied together. And of course, seeing is a very loaded word in the Bible, because seeing also very often indicates prophecy. The prophet is a seer.
Right.
And so
Jose,
when I see a
Roe,
word
right.
like, when I see a word like that repeating, then I have to ask myself, am I willing to lose a profound connection that's in the Hebrew by having a smoother English? And in this case, the answer was no. Ra'o ra'ita you could translate as I have taken note of, or I have noticed well what's happening. But then you lose this theme that threads through through Moshe's life. So it's always a question of judgment. Again, in a musical performance, if you have an orchestra, you have to decide which instruments to let out and which not to. And there are many thousands of examples of conductors and pianists who allow certain voices to sound, and others that just don't do that. So that's what I'm always concerned with. But I agree. I always have to make choices. Absolutely.
Right.
And something is often lost, but sometimes it works, and that's the goal.
Right, and this notion of light vault also comes from the music, the leitmotif. So we're
Yes.
quite consistent in that aspect. It's very interesting to think of it in the musical sense, because indeed your translation, very interestingly, is focusing on the sound, on the
Yes.
music of the text, if you will, if I may,
Yes.
And in many aspects, you indeed kind of stretch the English in order to even keep the actual sound, the actual phonetics of the Hebrew. I had this example, for instance, ready, and not this one. I actually wanted to show a different example from the birth of from Genesis 49, which has a lot of these examples related to the names and the puns between the names of the tribes and the names and what happens to them. And I think the most obvious one here is in verse 19. Okay, we have the Hebrew Gad Gedud Yegudenu Vehu Yagud Akev. So again, you chose to kind of stretch the English a little bit in a beautiful way, if I may, and choose a verb that even sounds similar.
Yeah. Sometimes you can do that.
Right.
Sometimes one is lucky.
Right. When one is lucky and one has the English for that. I am not a native English speaker, so it would be much difficult for me, much more difficult. But it also even sometimes goes with very famous verses, starting with tohu vavohu. Trying to, if not keep the actual original sound of the Hebrew, at least the relative relationship of sound, so to speak, between certain elements. So let's say tovavo. What did you decide to do, and why did you decide to do with this very famous two words in Genesis 1 and 2?
Well, this also brings up another issue, which is the issue of change. So originally, I wanted to express something of the rhyme, or use alliteration or assonance, something to indicate that this concept, unformed and void, which is a very flat description of the beginning of the world, that clearly what they're aiming at is something that can't be expressed in normal words, but only in some kind of poetry. So tohu, does seem to be a Hebrew word, but bohu is not. It looks like a made-up word. So I wanted to express it. I wanted to, again, slow the reader down and at least indicate that if you're going to describe the chaos at the beginning of the world, it has to be expressed through sound. So what I chose was wild and waste, which does not rhyme, but it does. The assonance does hopefully make you notice. Well, since then I've changed my mind a little bit, and right now, well, I've gone back to my original idea, which was confusion and chaos, because that works out better when these terms occur later in the Bible. But it's the same basic idea that one doesn't just go past something, and especially because it's traditional, unformed and void. JPS uses a trackless waste, which is accurate in terms of meaning, but not in terms of the feel of it. And for me, it has to have the resonance that's trying to convey an emotion, not only an idea.
And
so that's
when you talk about changes that were kind of a retrospect when you came to later parts of the Bible, that's an excellent segue to a question about what you're currently doing, which is, I would guess, the letter prophets, and I would guess Isaiah would be a specific hard nut to crack, right?
Yeah, that is very tough. Actually, right now I'm working on Haftarot, which of course are mostly prophetic, and that material is very difficult, especially Isaiah, who's the master poet. The late Theodore Gaster claimed, although I haven't seen it, he claimed to have translated all the puns into English that occur in Isaiah. It's an unpublished manuscript. But
I'll start with chapter 24. We'll see how he did with the others.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, another problem in chapter 10, right at the beginning, Hoi ha-chokakim hikake aven. So he's condemning the unjust laws that the king and the nobles are making, decrees. It means unjust laws, but that verb, really means to hammer in to stone, or to chisel into stone these unjust laws, which is a much more powerful idea. Now, in English, we do have the slang word chiselers, which means people who don't do the right thing or cheats. But I haven't been able to figure out a way to do that. So that may be one of the defeat passages. We'll see.
Right. So currently you're translating the Haftarot, which is there any prospect when it's gonna publish, or?
I never give a.
Oh, very good.
I never give a date.
It's a good strategy.
But it's almost finished.
Okay. When you consider the translation, I've noted that when you translate names, okay, you do kind of first of all, you keep the sound of the Hebrew name, which is again keeping the sound, connecting us to the sound. And secondly, whenever the name is presented for the first time, with you bother to explain it. And
I mean, I noticed that over the years, English Bibles would sometimes use a footnote. So they would give the name, and then you look at the bottom of the page, and it would say that is, or English meaning. And to me, that removes the meaning from the text. I mean, it's helpful to know about it, but it takes it away from the active part of it. Let me give you an example of a name that also has a lot to do with sound. The name of King David's son, Avshalom. This famous moment at the end of 2 Samuel, when David finds out that his son has been killed, despite the fact that he ordered the generals and the troops not to harm him. And so, David has this terrible moment and he cries out. If you look at the English translations, just the sound of the name really doesn't work. So it's, oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son, my son. Absalom is actually a very ugly sounding sound in English, really. But in Hebrew, it's Avshalom, it's a long vowel. And Beni, my son, is also a long vowel. So you get instead Beni Avshalom, Beni, Beni Avshalom, Beni, Beni. It mimics more the sounds of mourning. These long vowels somehow fit the emotion. It's very much like the beginning of the book of Eicha, Lamentations, also very difficult to render. Eicha yashava vadad ha'ir rabati am. Well, these are mostly feminine nouns and verbs, but this ah sound fits somehow the
Almost like an interjection, like an
yeah,
aha,
yeah,
oi,
yeah,
oi,
yeah,
all of these
yeah, exactly.
interjections.
It really reflects the emotion. So to the extent that you can sometimes reflect that in English, that's great. If you can't, you can't. But there's an example where the sound of a name, not only the meaning, all this ironic meaning with shalom in the middle of a character who's not very peaceful.
Right, and even when he's asking, Hashalom lanar Avshalom, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So it's all over the place, and there again, the text uses language in this very plastic way to convey emotions and ideas, and sometimes you can reproduce that.
Right.
Yeah.
And which names, in regards to Benjamin. So here, I took this example of Benjamin, and we have a name given by the mother and a name given later on, rendered a little bit differently by the father.
Mm-hmm.
But Ben Oni, is not just son of my woe, it's also son of my strength, right?
Yeah.
Because on could work that way. So kind of we have a reinterpretation of that name in kind of solving, so to speak, the ambiguity that is left by Rachel here by the Jacob in the positive way. He's got two options. Obviously, the mother went for the negative meaning of son of my woe or son of my sorrow. And the father kind of says, oh, the son of my right hand, son of my strength. So indeed, to what extent would you explain these things in your notes? Because you also add notes to many of these verses.
Yeah, I did realize at some point that it was a little bit too utopian to expect every reader to figure out what I'm trying to do. So there are notes there, and that's the kind of thing that I would make mention of. I might mention a previous translation or something that occurs in the Greek, or depending on. Again, it's a judgment call. I have to put myself in the place of the reader and ask what would be helpful to know at this point. So that's usually the criterion for going forward with that.
Okay. This is I would say that as far as the tradition of translation, this is a kind of a unique, yet I see the foundations of such a translation, not just in the obvious Buber Rosenzweig kind of lineage, which is almost a direct lineage to your translation, and definitely we can talk about that. But I see your translation as, to some extent, continuing a tradition of translation that goes back already to ancient times. If we take the Jewish revisions, so to speak, of the three Aquila, Sumachos, and Theodotion, especially known for that Aquila with his translation as a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, and et
Right.
lerabot, translating Genesis 1:1, the definite direct object marker et, which is really intranslatable to English in most of its occurrences, being translated as eat soon, okay, and also translating the word bereshit by kephalai, or the head, using the same word for head. So to what extent do you feel continuing that tradition, and how it fits into the Buber Rosenzweig tradition?
Yeah, I really came out of the Buber Rosenzweig tradition first. And to the extent that it has a connection to some of these ancient works, it's really mainly because of what I'm trying to do. Ed Greenstein, whom you've interviewed also, wrote some very fine essays about Jewish Bible translation and its history. So I was aware of those, but not as influenced, so to speak. It really was initially from the German, not from the German, but with the influence of the German, and then trying to absorb a way of listening to the text and going from there. So this was not entirely planned out ideologically. I will say that at the time that I started, which is back in the late 60s, JPS had come out, and there were many translations that tried to provide a totally smooth English, idiomatic English, and which therefore lost a lot of the force of the Hebrew. And that was my main concern. You know, something like in the story, again going back to baby Moses, where he's put in a basket. And of course, biblical Hebrew has several words for basket, but instead they chose an Egyptian word, teva, the same word that's used for Noah's Ark. And obviously, there's a connection that is meant between the two stories. So to use two different words there, as almost everybody did, was not going to do. I will say that the King James translation did use the same word. So they were very sensitive to these things.
Okay, that's very interesting to hear that the King James Version did that, but they were a group of people. You're doing it all by yourself, you know. That's like an endeavor to take upon oneself that is of incredible magnitude, and that's, you know.
I was young at the time.
Yeah, and indeed, I had the privilege of studying under Professor Greenstein and under Professor Tov at the Hebrew University, and many of these great scholars. And I wanted to ask, how do you, what is the thought process that you try to adopt when you're dealing with a difficult verse? And moreover, and I had the example just from Numbers.
I would say you use, you broke up there for a minute. You know, I used all the committee members I can get, some of whom are not alive anymore, and friends, and you know, a few scholar friends to consult also, and commentaries. I mean, you try and see what's out there, and then make a judgment. But of course, there's a lot, you know, and of course, Professor Greenstein tackled Job, which is almost impossible, but did it nobly and well. I mean, one has to use, you know, one's teachers and earlier teachers, and see what people have said. But then in the end, you have to make a judgment call and try it, and then put it aside for a few months, and then look at it again and decide whether it's total nonsense, or, you know, maybe you got something almost right.
Okay. You talked about the subject of change. wild and waste versus confusion and chaos.
Yeah.
By the way, I think again, it's not before me, but I think wild and waste was also chosen by Robert Alter in his work.
No, he used welter and waste.
Oh, welter and waste. So,
It's not a
but I
word.
remember that he kept the
Yeah.
W there, and that is very powerful translation. Here noted Kuba and Kovata.
Yeah.
You know how to in the face of the reader
Yeah,
reading.
it's very strange. I mean, again, there's a note on that, and would I do it the same way today? I have to think about it again because kovata may just mean her tent, or something like that. But I chose to keep some kind of pun operative there. It's of course one of the most horrifying stories in the Torah, and in
Yeah, the
terms of
Bible,
being able.
generally speaking, the Bible should not be taught in a Sunday school, right? There are kids there. Right.
No, I always say that it's not necessarily a book for children.
Right. What are like translations that you would have, in retrospect, changed as an example, maybe?
Good question. I mean, I already have a revised edition, which has appeared in the accordance program.
This is the accordance one that we have
Yeah,
here on screen.
accordance. It's a software, and hopefully that will come out in in hardcover or paperback. So I've made actually a fair amount of changes, and sometimes these are fairly minor. There's an expression in the Bible, ma zot asita,
Right.
which sometimes gets translated as "what is this that you have done?"
Right.
But zot or zeh there really is a little bit different, and it's something closer to, what now have you done, or what then have you done? It's not this at all. So those are kinds of small places where I've changed things.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I do. Zot is obviously the demonstrative proximal pronoun, also used
yeah,
as sometimes a relative pronoun.
yeah,
But you want to stretch it into what is how do you see, obviously zot, ze, zu, zo, and the d in the Aramaic and the in the Arabic, they all stem
yeah.
from the same Proto-Semitic relative
Yeah.
pronoun and demonstrative pronoun. And you suggest, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
This seems to work in all those cases. It feels better to me. But and there are other cases where, for instance, I originally, in some cases, I follow Buber Rosenzweig, not that many in terms of specific words, but Buber translated Mizbeach as, instead of as altar, as slaughter site, Schlachtstatt. And, it's not only animals that are brought, but grain also. And in Ugaritic, there's more of a meaning of something like a sacrificial meal. So in the end, I decided to change that from slaughter site, which just was distracting. Every time it came up, it was jarring. And so I've changed it back to the traditional altar, and it doesn't really get in the way anymore. So that was one case where I, made a new decision. And you can see this very much as an analogy to performing. Again, I go back to a musical model. Every time you look at this, every time you read it out loud, every time you reconsider it, it's different. The text doesn't change, but the reader does.
Right. I loved your example with FDR, Uh,
Uh,
that if you could give it, I enjoyed it so much.
uh, when in the
I
Pearl
saw
Harbor
yeah the Pearl Harbor speech.
yeah, I didn't remember whether I had written that. I've talked about that before. Yeah, I mean, we have the original draft, and he says yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in world history. Just perfectly clear and pretty powerful. But at some point, he rethought it and crossed it out and wrote in a date which will live in infamy, for emphasis, because infamy is much stronger, and even the sound is stronger than world history. Well, that's what a great speech is, and even the way he pronounced it. The United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked, as if there's a dagation in the L. You know, so it's both the way it's written and the way it's performed. And I'm sad to say that when I hear many people reading from the Bible in a class or in a synagogue or a church or elsewhere, they don't always have the skills of FDR. Let's put it that way. So
Okay,
I
now
try
I'm
and
self-conscious on the way I read the text. I don't know if it was good enough.
I try and imagine Orson Welles reading my text, and that usually works better.
Okay, very good. Now, within the developing understanding of linguistics, there is a shift towards, in recent decades, I should say, uh, in the world of grammar, to kind of zoom out and not just talk about phonology, which we've talked about, morphology, not even zooming out from the syntax and talk about semantics and pragmatics. How are these reflected in your translation?
In terms of theory?
In terms of theory, and whenever, if you have examples, how are they put in practice?
In terms of theory, almost not at all. I work really I come at this in a way from the artistic side, although I try and ground it in philology. But I don't think in terms of broad theories, in terms of what I'm doing. I try and do what I'm doing. There are, I suppose, sculptors and painters and musicians who have elaborate theories about what they're doing. I mean, I hope I'm clear about what my goals are. But if you were to ask me to write a 200-page book on my theory of translation, I would much rather show you a 3-page story and go through it. And so to the extent that it's somewhat of an unconscious approach, and but theory does not enter a great deal into it. That's why some of Professor Greenstein's essays are very helpful, because he really has laid out, he has an essay called Theories of Modern Bible Translation, for instance.
Yeah.
So,
And
they're helpful to me, but that's not how I work.
okay, understandably. So when you embarked upon it, how different was your view of what you're doing was when you started in the late 60s and today, a few days later, 2020?
Yeah, basically, I'm a little bit less willing to stretch English beyond the boundaries. I'm trying to be a little bit nicer to the reader, and to to come a little bit closer to not doing violence to the English. Although again, I will change that at times. When I was working on the Ten Commandments originally, and still, when I got to lo tinaf, which in English is "you shall not commit adultery," You commit murder, you commit adultery, but you steal and lie, and all
You
those
shall
are
not
period.
adulter, you had, right?
Yeah, so I wrote adulter, and I mean, if you look it up in the dictionary, it does mean to commit adultery. It's very jarring, but the Ten Commandments have a rhythm,
Right.
lo tirtzach, lo tignov. I mean, it's part of a rhetorical thing, and I hate to break that up. So that I kept, but in general, I've tried to look this over and make it a little bit smoother. Buber did the same thing, by the way, over time. Actually, Buber and Rosenzweig did after their Genesis was published. Immediately thereafter, they started revising, and the final product is less outlandish than the original was. So I'm always cognizant of that. It depends on, if something is awkward and doesn't have to be, I'll get rid of it. If something is awkward because I feel the Hebrew is awkward, I'll keep it.
When you talk about awkward, when I talk to my students oftentimes and they ask me, first of all, I grew up in Israel in a Hebrew speaking household. I was really never exposed to English translations until I really became a teacher, and I teach biblical Hebrew and biblical Aramaic, and there was no reason for me to actually interact with any English translations of the Hebrew Bible. But as I started teaching, students would always ask me, and sometimes I notice the students going, especially at the beginning, towards the very literal, trying to be very literal about their translation. And as I told you, I collect Bibles. So here I have Young's literal translation, and quite different than the Aussie Bible, different technique. But today, even mechanical translations that kind of have a set equivalent with which they work throughout the text, and so forth. But keeping the literal aspect of the text, again, when you do it strategically, it forces the reader to feel obviously kind of a stranger in the text if they are English readers. And I think, as you said, you're doing it as a strategy. But there is something that is problematic in the sense that you lose the distinction between the marked and unmarked in the target language. So when a student comes to me and asks, oh, it says Vaidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, so I would so why would you translate it? And the Lord spoke to Moses and so forth. And I say to them, there is kind of the marked order and the unmarked order. And by keeping the Hebrew syntax, again, going back to the discussion we had at the beginning concerning what you have to kind of forego is the distinction between the marked and the unmarked in the target language.
No, there are always things that you have to sacrifice. You cannot really reproduce in English this effect of the vav, vaidaber, and the string of verbs that all begin with vav. Now, alter uses and most of the time. I don't agree with that. I think it's a little overdone. You don't really hear it as much in the Hebrew. But absolutely, I've seen a couple of other attempts to be more literal than I am. And to my mind, they really fail because they're so far over the line that you get distracted by that. So, it becomes a matter of compromise, and it becomes a matter, I mean, I hate to use this term again, of intuition, of a feel that, again, a performer has for presenting various kinds of material, and it will vary tremendously. There are one of the things that I studied a lot is Melville's great American novel Moby Dick, and the famous chapter in there, Father Mapple's sermon at the beginning of the book, where before they go on the voyage, they go into this chapel, and this old pastor comes and he gives a drush on the book of Jonah.
Right.
And there are, 4 or 5 movie and TV versions of that. And I was watching them the other day. And, some people just read it and it's not very good. And then Orson Welles, who was very nervous about making that scene, gets up and he delivers this incredible, very short, but memorable speech in a way that nobody else could. So, and I'm always sensitive about this, even in a synagogue setting, when people chant the Torah, I am sometimes a little bit annoyed because they're just singing this thing and the words are not coming out, and the grammar
Right.
is not coming out,
I have someone who I hope will be our guest. I love his reading. When he reads the Song of Songs, for instance, he actually mimics the woman and the man and he does keeping the tropes, keeping the tamim, which obviously are not just syntactical but also melodical. But he uses a higher pitch that's an amazing thing. I am not gifted musically enough to do it. So when I read, according to the tamim, obviously, and according to, I happen to be teacher of biblical Hebrew, so I hope I'm not doing that bad, but I'm not gifted musically enough to do the whole performance of it, which is in many aspects very important, because the dialogues, and especially in the Song of Songs, when you have the beloved and the woman, very, very strong, very strong.
Absolutely.
Obviously, you have different opinions who's saying what,
Of course.
But that's beside that
There's
point.
so many dramatic moments, even in the Adam and Eve story, in terms of emphasis, it really depends on how you read. And so it's not just the words on the page, but the way in which the reader brings them to life, and that's always the challenge with this material.
And it's not enough to follow the syntactical division of the tamim, which does much of the work, but not all of the work. It is a must, but it's not enough. I can see what you're saying, but we oftentimes, again, we are bound by the syntactical division of the tamim and bound by the melodical tradition of the tamim. So the leeway of the performer in a synagogue is somewhat limited, and you have to be very gifted to use that leeway in a way that could convey the message.
Absolutely. I mean, there are such people out there, but they are not many of them.
Not many. I even though I understand the concept, I don't feel
more in Israel than there are here, certainly.
Yeah, and to be understood, and given the fact that Hebrew is the native language of people here. Though again, the problems with Israelis in regards to biblical Hebrew is that they think they know it, which is a whole different problem. They don't, at least with someone from, let's say, I had Korean friends when I studied at the Hebrew U and Bar Ilan, they know they have to open the lexicon, and Israeli, no, I know it, well, the meaning of the word is different. Okay. What are, if it's okay, I want to open it for a Q&A with the guys a little bit. So first of all, thank you. I had a great time talking with you, and let's hear some of the questions of our guests, of our attendees. Simon, please.
I'd like to start with a brief statement. Roughly around 1974, my English teacher told me, "That's not a poem," which is the reason I'm here today. It's like a 50-year quest to find out what a poem is, and that's why I appreciate hearing the things you've said. But my question is, does German help you in translating into English?
Well, the German helped in terms of highlighting certain things about the Hebrew, I would say. In other words, that pointed me in a direction. It riveted my attention on certain features that I would have otherwise missed or ignored. So to that extent, it did help. And once in a while, there's a cognate or some connection between German and English, but not that often. So it was helpful. Let's put it that way.
So if I could squeeze in a second question.
Yeah.
Squeeze in a second question, be greedy. When we were talking about the translation of the book of Job, we came across puns between ancient Egyptian and Hebrew. I think the word was am, wasn't it? Man, people and intelligence. Yeah. I mean, obviously Egypt and Israel at that time were like England and France, they're like next door neighbors. Were the language, I know they have different roots.
The languages are not at all similar.
Right.
In my understanding, Egyptian is not a Semitic language. So, there are occasional words.
Sorry?
And I'd say there are occasional words.
Right.
The name Moses, for instance, which we always connect in the Bible to, I drew him out of the water. Well, that consonantal name in Egyptian simply means son of, like Ramses is son of Ra.
Right.
So it's a good Egyptian name, but the biblical writer has repurposed it, and actually there's a double pun because the princess thinks that she's naming him because she drew him out of the water, but the grammatical form Moshe really means he who draws somebody else out of the water, may be an allusion to the splitting of the sea. So there are all these levels going on at the same time, and the only way to reproduce that is with a nice footnote, which I keep on the page.
Because she was an Egyptian princess, she did not know that
the
so active
it's
participle instead of the passive participle. Right.
Quite a complex moment, but it's the old story that people are on the actors or the characters are doing one thing, but we in the audience know something else.
Thank you. Georgie, yes.
Thank you, sir. It was a very good time to spend with you. My question is, at what stage you thought about going more seriously into translation? Because all of us, when we study the Bible, there will be different inclinations. But what was the moment that it triggered, or were there something which came naturally to you?
Can Netanel, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure.
My hearing,
believe it or not, this is a regular procedure. I became teaching all around the world. I became, already proficient in that. Georgie's asking, by the way, from Abu Dhabi, he's asking the question.
Oh, wonderful.
He's asking, what made you decide to embark upon this journey of translating the Bible? Because naturally, when we read the Bible, we think about, especially if we are native to a different language than Hebrew, we might kind of translate it in our mind. But what made you decide, okay, I'm gonna translate the most translated book of the world, which is possibly intranslatable at all, but to take upon to start walking this path that many have walked, but in a different way?
Well, as I said before, I was young, which really always helps, because the young do not have the perspective to realize what the larger picture is always. I really just started out, I had come across the Buber Rosenzweig translation at the Brandeis Library when I was a senior in college, and was knocked out by it. I was so surprised. And then the next year, I decided to try one chapter just to see what would happen. And that, of course, was the Akedah, Genesis 22. That's really cheating because it's the most interesting chapter and has a lot to say. And then I somehow got hooked. Part of it was that I knew that the Buber Rosenzweig translation was in many ways lost. It was used in Germany after the war, but of course the original community, the Jewish community there, was destroyed. So part of it was wanting to keep some of it alive, give something back. In retrospect now, I realize that for me it had a lot to do with my own personality, the sort of combination of the pedantic and scholarly and the artistic, so it fit very nicely. And so I finally did a draft of Bereshit, of Genesis, which is a narrative book and doable. And then it circulated for a while. It was published in a magazine called Response. And then eventually I revised it, and a publisher became interested, Schocken, actually. So it really evolved. It was not part of a grand master plan at the age of 21. Let's put it that way. It sort of crept up on me, and then I was pushed to do Exodus, and then, but it took a while. So, but life takes you in strange directions, and I found this to be a good medium of expression for me in many ways. And this kind of translation was not particularly being done at that time, in the 60s and 70s. And then the whole kind of literary movement on the Bible started, looking at the way in which the text works, using the techniques of repetition and sound and so on. And people started writing about it. So when I first did this, when the late 70s came around, I did not get tenure at my university. By the time I published the 5 books, I did, because the field had changed. So it's one of those interesting things.
Okay, Elliot?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Fox. This has been amazing. I wanted to ask a question, especially for someone who's like a non-native Hebrew speaker. You mentioned your use of commentary, literary, some of the literary stuff, Melville. Mm-hmm. And how much of that is mixed with a little bit of your intuition and lexical studies? Could you how would you help someone, with, just being, delving into the lexicons? Kind of maybe your helpful tips or approach.
I mean, you try and find the best resources that you can. One of the things that I have found helpful, big multi-volume set, Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, which does not have every word, but has very in-depth word studies. And while I don't always accept everything they say, it's very helpful to see, how different people have looked at a word and all its occurrences and so on. So that's the kind of thing that's helpful, and the dictionaries and the articles, and it's an overwhelming amount of stuff. So you have to choose initially, but those are the kinds of things that are helpful. And intuition really only pretty much at the end, I would say. I've grown more cautious and tried to be responsible about it. So,
thank you. Very helpful. Thank you.
I think
very interesting. Even the theological word book of the Old Testament comes from the German Theologische zum Altes Testament, and so
it's those scholars, and not everybody will agree with them, but
right. I remember when I was attending the Hebrew University, the joke was that what's the most important Semitic language? German, right? Because all of the grammar books were for Hebrew, Arabic, Akkadian, you name it. Yes, they were all in German. So
in the old days.
Today English. But still, they make you jump through a hoop. You want to do masters in Bible studies at the Hebrew University, you have to take German and much other stuff as well. So thank you very much. It was an excellent time. It was a real pleasure indeed. I just want to tell you that, people here are from indeed all over the world, from Europe, from the US, from Africa, even from Asia, who wake up, you know, in the middle of the night to hear these conversations. Indeed,
very kind of them.
thank you for your time. And we have this thing
Pleasure.
when we say thank
Anytime.
you to our guests.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Love
it.
how you integrated your music, Professor Fox. And I just
Yeah.
want to say, people are from far and near, but I almost went to Clark and ended up going to BU. So
Well,
far
I
and
taught
near.
there first before Clark, so
Yeah,
yeah.
I
Good
saw that in
music
your
department at
bio. Thank you so much. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shalom. Yeah.
Shalom, shalom, Professor.
Shalom.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Guys, tomorrow we have Dr. Miri Kahana. We'll talk about the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew, and that's for tomorrow. Next week, I'm taking a vacation, family vacation, August. So we'll see each other on Sunday and Monday. Monday we'll talk about the Te'amim, bringing an expert. She did her studies in music and in Bible. So she's an expert on both, and I'll tell you a little bit secret. Believe it or not, she's also a medical doctor. So some people are like that, gifted in so many ways. And you'll be able to ask her about COVID-19 because she actually treats people.
No.
Yeah, so yeah. I already had students in class with COVID-19. So yeah, that's one of the advantages of online teaching. So that's that. And thank you guys, and thank you, Professor, again.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Shalom.
you.
Shalom.
Toda rabah.